My name's Professor Jeremy Spencer and I'm Professor of Nutritional Medicine at the University of Reading. Tonight I'll be presenting some of our data concerning the effects of diet on cognition and cognitive health in both older and younger people, and also to try to understand and give an overview of some of the mechanisms by which we think these dietary components are working on the brain. I hope that the audience will be able to take away from my talk some aspects of the best practices of diet, some of the best examples of particularly fruits and vegetables which can be consumed and can provide some real benefits towards cognitive health and cognitive aging. I'm going to be giving you an overview of something else which we do every day, or all of us do every day, and that's participate in eating foods, and as you'll all be aware, some foods are known to be better for us than others. My talk's mainly going to be dealing with the actions of some plant-based compounds. These are known as flavonoids. Some of you may have heard of these before. If not, hopefully by the end of my presentation you'll have a better understanding of what they are and what they can do for us. So before I start, I just wanted to give you some questions to think about. Don't have to answer them now, but we're all aware of the 5-a-day message for fruit and vegetable intake. Hopefully most of you here will be achieving that. Is that true? Do most of you manage to consume 5 a day? If not, then I would try to encourage you to integrate more fruits and vegetables into your diet, but just think about whether or not all fruits and vegetables are as beneficial to us in relation to each other. Any ideas about that? Would you say, in the ones I've shown there, which would you say would be the most efficacious for us and the least efficacious for us? Yeah, so things like broccoli and orange, they're very rich in what we term phytochemicals, and these are these flavonoids and these other compounds which we know, and we've showed at Reading and other places around the world, which can have good effects on our health. Whereas things like potatoes are mainly starch, so they're not so phytochemical rich. What about blueberries? So blueberries are termed superfoods. Are they better for us than all other fruits out there? What do you think about that? No, certainly not. I mean, they are rich in one particular class of flavonoid compounds, which are certainly good for our health. But there are also very beneficial compounds in other fruits and other vegetables. For example, oranges contain another group, and this is the reason, I guess, we've had the shots on the desk today. So it doesn't matter if you're sitting this side and you had the berries, or this side and you had the orange. They're equal in their ability to help our cognitive health. And finally, a lot of you will have heard about dark chocolate. Is it more effective than milk chocolate at being good for us? It certainly should be, because it contains more of the cocoa bean, but it very much depends on the manufacturing of the chocolate. And in some cases, milk chocolates can actually be higher in these compounds than dark chocolate. You're looking for that astringency and that mouthfeel. Bitterness is generally a good indication that these compounds are present within the diet. And we've sort of bred a lot of this bitterness out of our crops because we like sugary, sweet, pleasant things to eat. But actually those bitter compounds, those astringent compounds, which can actually give us some very good health effects. So flavonoids themselves are actually found throughout nature. They are giving the bright colours to berries, and that's, we choose berries in supermarkets based on their colour. But they're also found in flowers. They give flowers colour, they give the autumn leaves colour to a certain extent when the chlorophyll degrades, and they're also found in vegetables such as aubergine. In terms of where we get them in our diet, well, we get them broadly in fruits and vegetables, but there are some particularly rich sources like green and black tea, particularly green tea. If you like a cup of black tea every day, I would encourage you to try to maybe switch one of those for a cup of green tea. Green tea is probably about 10 times higher in these compounds than black tea. Also things like citrus, as already mentioned, lemons and limes and grapefruits and the juices contain very high concentrations of these. And you'll be happy to know that things like red wine contain, and even to a degree, champagne contain these compounds in high concentrations. Chocolate and cocoa also contain high amounts. They're slightly different in structure, but they have very similar effects on our bodies, as you'll see. And I already mentioned berries. It doesn't have to be blueberries, it can be any brightly coloured berry, and indeed any brightly coloured fruit or vegetable is usually an indication that's a very rich source of these beneficial phytonutrients. So blueberries certainly aren't unique. If you actually look at the chemical constituents in lots of foods, you will start to find some of these compounds in there. This is actually the structure of these compounds. I'm not sure if that works. Sorry. So this is the structure in the middle there. It looks a little bit complex if none of you have done chemistry before. This structure does define the function, although I must stress at this point we're not entirely sure how exactly they work within our bodies, but I will hopefully give you an idea of some of the mechanisms by which they work. It does involve actions on blood flow, and actually that also has the added benefit, as well as helping the brain and the cognition, it also will improve your cardiovascular health. Cocoa, well, cocoa contains not only anthocyanins. If you extract cocoa very carefully, it's actually purple in colour because it contains those very similar compounds as we find in berries. Unfortunately, when we manufacture chocolate and cocoa in an industrial setting, some of those compounds are lost, and that's a lot of the time where we work to try and improve these processes to produce better foods. And, well, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but this is a sort of summary of the types of effects that these compounds, these phytonutrients, these flavonoids, which are found in fruits and vegetables and in derived beverages and juices, can have on our body. So I'm going to be dealing mainly with the brain effects today. And there's been lots of aspects of activity on the brain, not only cognition, but also through observational, and some clinical trials have shown some efficacious effects against things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. And there's really been a long history of that research, which is now starting to go into the clinical setting. But they can also help in preventing cancer and tumour growth. They can improve your cardiovascular health, and they can also positively affect inflammatory processes as well. So where did it all start? Well, it started really with something called the French paradox, which Serge Renaud published back in the Lancet, back in the early 90s. And he was looking at this linear correlation between saturated fat intake of an animal origin and ischemic heart disease risk or death of some kind of cardiovascular incidents. And most countries, this is simplified for the presentation today, most countries fell on a linear relationship. As you increase the fat, you increase your risk. But some countries like France and Spain and Portugal and indeed Japan were somehow protected against this. And other countries, at the time Czechoslovakia, were well above this line. And this was put down partly to do with diet. And certainly this is where the Mediterranean diet concept came from. And then if you look at wine consumption and cardiovascular disease risk, we see something called a J-shaped curve. So if you look on the graph there, anything below the line, below 1, is a protection against, in this case, cardiovascular disease risk. Your chances of getting either a stroke or a heart attack. And you can see at moderate intakes of red wine, you get protection. And of course, as you increase that, as you would imagine, alcohol then contributes to the detrimental effects. But at low concentrations in moderate amounts, you can see some protection. It's very complex, and there are other things like the alcohol which are also affecting the central nervous system, but to a degree, those flavonoids are actually protecting the vascular system. And also, a few years ago, I was involved in a study which was looking at a population, or a native population called the Cunaramarins, which live on an island off the coast of Panama. And they seemed to almost suffer from no high blood pressure, and they had a very low cardiovascular disease risk, certainly when they were in their 60s and 70s. And this was thought to be genetic, and so some medics from Harvard went anchored off the off the island in a yacht and went onto the island and tried to sort of look into this in a little bit more detail. And one thing which stood out when they looked at a genetically similar population of the Cunaramarins which had moved to Panama City was diet. Diet had changed quite significantly. And indeed, when you looked at this in detail, you could see that actually the island-dwelling community, which were following this very traditional diet, which was actually very rich in cocoa. So there's no running water, there's no piped water on the island. They store the water in drums and they sterilize it. They realized over the years that if they add cocoa beans into the water, it is effective sterilization. But what this meant was that they were consuming very high levels of these flavonoids. And this was seemingly protecting them against this cardiovascular disease risk. Of course, the genetically similar population, their relatives which had moved to the city, no longer consumed this. And they started to suffer from higher blood pressure again. So what about cognition? Well, a few years ago, a study was published. This is, again, looking at MMSE. This is this clinical marker of Alzheimer's disease or dementia. So it's a very broad assessment. Studied over 10 years, if you look at the top line, the solid line there, this is the highest level of flavonoid intake assessed on questionnaires and diets intake data, compared to the lowest, which is the dashed line. You can see that actually the MMSE, this clinical assessment, didn't fall as far as the group which were consuming the lower amounts. Again, an indication that having a good diet rich in these plant-based phytochemicals, even starting in later life, can have quite a significant effect on your cognitive evolution and your cognitive health. So what we've done at Reading is try to sort of study that more in a clinical setting, so where we can control the diets more accurately. Out in the real world, we can only really assess large populations what people are eating by asking them. And of course, that's affected by recall, memory, and other things. So if we can actually assess and give these diets specifically, we can be much more sure about the results. But we also need to have very solid and optimal and sensitive cognitive tests, and they're very similar to the ones the previous speaker mentioned, with slight differences, and are designed to measure different aspects of memory. For example, like the speed of processing, executive memory, or attention, visual spatial learning, and verbal learning and memory. And of course, many of these are defined in many different areas in the brain. And if these compounds can be affecting these different areas of the brain, either directly through interactions with neurons and glias within the brain, or the cells within the brain, or by changing blood flow, by promoting blood flow to these regions, then we would expect them to have nice effects on improving cognitive function. So one of the studies we've done here at Reading, one of the biggest ones we've done, has been with a cocoa flavanol intervention. So this is not too dissimilar to consuming a cup of cocoa before you go to bed or in the morning, whenever you would like to consume it. And one thing that stood out here was that they were active over a very short time frame. So within 2 hours after consuming these flavonoid-rich cocoa versus a control. So in this case, the blue bars are the high flavanol cocoa and the red bars are the low flavanol cocoa. You can see that executive function, mainly markers of attention and sustained attention and optimum processing of information, was greatly improved after only 2 hours of consumption of these cocoa flavanols. And in terms of episodic memory, we had an attenuation of a decline in functionality over that 2 hour period. So some real powerful effects over a very short time frame. And if you look at the graph on the right-hand side, this is again tests which measure attentional performance, your ability to maintain attention on complex tasks for periods of time. We can see that versus a control, which is the circles in the plot, where we get a decline in functionality, a decline in attention over a sort of 1 to 5 hour period. We don't see that decline if you've consumed 2 portions of blueberries. So this is 160 grams, fitting in with a 5 a day, so a portion being 80 grams, about the size of your fist. You manage to get rid of that effect very quickly over a short time frame. So how can this possibly be working? Well, those of you that are aware of what flavonoids are, you may have come across the term an antioxidant. Is that correct? So certainly when I started working in this area, everyone thought that flavonoids and other phytonutrients worked as antioxidants. We actually now know that it's not true. They actually work in a much more interesting way, in a much more powerful way. We know that's not true because we don't absorb them to the extent that they can actually have functionality like that. Rather what they do, and you'll be pleased to know, I'm not going to go into the sort of molecular biology of this, but they can induce changes in cerebrovascular blood flow. They can change blood flow to the brain. They can improve the circulation. They can improve the health of your circulatory system as a whole. They can also modulate synaptic plasticity, and synaptic plasticity is a complex term, but is actually the term which is used to underpin how our memory works. So our brains need to be plastic to adapt, to store and learn new information. And they can also inhibit neuroinflammation, and that has definite clinical examples within things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. So they can do all of these things, and certainly normal antioxidants can't do that. Indeed, not long ago in 2000, Professor Kandel won the Nobel Prize for actually determining to a large degree how our memory works. And how our memory works is by changing the structure of proteins temporarily by adding just very small changes to proteins within the brain, which allow them to be involved in storing short-term memory or holding short-term memory. And then if you want to go then and store that for longer periods of time, this involves new protein synthesis in the brain. And certainly from some of the cellular studies we were doing at the time, using flavonoid metabolites as they would be appearing in the circulation after we consumed them in our diets, we know that we saw that they could be having very similar effects. So there was some logic to actually moving into looking at whether these could work in humans. And indeed, seemingly they do. With what we don't understand, of course, is exactly how they work at the moment. So an example flavonoid in the middle there, the flavanols, they're found in cocoa, they're found in blueberry, they're also found in green tea and black tea, they're found in the skin of apple, the skin of pears. So if you enjoy eating apples and pears, please don't remove the skin. All the useful compounds are actually in the skin. The flesh is largely just a sugar solution and a bit of fibre, so please leave the skin on, but they can lower blood pressure, they can improve blood pressure, and we know a lot of these vascular markers are anyway linked to dementia. So if you have high blood pressure, that is a clinical prerequisite for, or a prognostic or diagnostic test for your likelihood of getting dementia in later life, or indeed a stroke which can lead to dementia. They can improve vascular function, as I mentioned, and they can also decrease things like blood clotting. So they can prevent the last stage of a heart attack or the last stage of a stroke. And some of them can be quite powerful. So we've done studies with blueberry smoothies on blood flow in the periphery, and hopefully this will work. But the top one is a blueberry intervention, and there's a control intervention. We use a machine which measures the blood flow in the microcirculation in the arm in this case, but it's an indication of blood flow to the peripheries, including the brain. And if I press the button, you can see that if you've had the blueberry smoothie compared to the control, you have a much greater degree of blood flow to the skin, to the periphery. Again, as a marker, a surrogate marker of better blood flow everywhere in the body. And it's really quite significant. And this is presumably through interactions of the compounds which we absorb through the gut. And also I'll make a note here that probably our gut microbiota, the bacteria in our lower guts, are also very important in promoting better absorption of these compounds. So if you have a good gut microbiota, you probably get stronger effects even than we see here. We've also looked at blood flow in other ways, using the types of markers that you would find in hospitals, for instance. One of them is called FMD, this is flow-mediated dilatation. And again, if you look at the y-axis or the up-axis on that scale, you see a percent FMD. an improvement in blood flow broadly around the body is manifested by an increase in the FMD. And if you can look at the two curves which are going up there, so the flat one at the bottom with the dashed line and the circles is the control. And then the triangles is I've called it anthocyanins, this was again blueberry. And the flavanols in this case was cocoa. Similar responses, just slightly different effects in terms of the time, and this directly affects your difference in absorption. But both of them are very effective at promoting good blood flow around the body, and that's going to be a good thing, not only for our vascular system, but also for the brain. And I would say a 1% increase in the FMD response equates to about a 10% risk reduction in things like heart attacks and strokes. So of course, in terms of those cognitive effects, we also would like to know whether or not they're promoting blood flow to the brain. And if so, how do they do that, and to what regions? Is it everywhere, or is it very specific? And we were lucky enough, about 5 years ago, the university invested in an MRI, which is situated in psychology, and we were one of the first research groups to use this, looking at the effects of diet on blood flow to the brain. So this is a sort of cross-section, so sections through the brain in this direction, looking down on them, and looking at the effect on blood flow after consuming a blueberry intervention of 160 grams, very similar to what I showed you in terms of the dose which improved those attentional performances. And you can see that blood flow is very specific. It goes to very specific areas, some of which we've already heard about this evening. So these prefrontal cortex areas, but also in other areas involved with things like visual processing and even processing of sound, so like the lateral occipital cortex, the presental gyrus. It's interesting that these are very specific, and we don't know at this time whether or not you need to have some brain activity occurring at the time. So do you need to be performing these tests or be cognitively active? It seems to be that you get certain changes at rest. So if you consume, say, a blueberry smoothie at rest and you don't do anything, you try not to use your brain, of course it's very difficult, you get very different blood flow effects than if you're actually using your brain to do certain activities. And what we think might be going on is that if the compounds are present, they are promoting neuronal activity by allowing better blood flow to the regions necessary, which you're using when processing or doing these tasks. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but it's certainly a good first indication that not only do they affect things like the cardiovascular system, but they also affect the vascular system within the brain. And this manifests in a better cognitive performance. So how might they be working? So they're not antioxidants, and I mentioned that they can interact at a molecular level. And actually there's the idea of a sort of a hormetic effect. So, and actually this says something quite interesting to us in that there probably is going to be an optimum intake. There will be an amount of these compounds which will give you the optimum effect. And if you go higher than that, it won't be detrimental, but it won't be as strong. And why does that happen? Well, why do plants make these compounds in the first place? Well, plants make them as a stress response. If you stress plants, if you infect them with a virus or a bacterium, or you subject them to drought stress, or you wound them in some way, then they produce these compounds, these flavonoids, as a response. They can't get up and walk away from the stress. They have to have a chemical response. So they start to produce these small triangles, these circles, and these are these flavonoids that I've been talking about. And of course, when we eat the plant, we eat the flavonoids as well. And what do they do in plants? Well, they bind to receptors on the surface of plant cells, and they trigger pathways which promote a disease resistance response. And actually, because these pathways are very well conserved in animal cells and mammalian cells, they have a very similar response. Slightly different, of course, because we have different stress responses as humans. But they bind to the same receptors, they induce the same pathways. The only difference is the proteins and the response that they produce in the different cell types. So actually much more drug-like effects than we certainly imagined at first. As I mentioned, antioxidant effects are very simplistic. They interact with free radicals and remove them. These are much more specific. So I suppose the goal of our research in terms of what we're doing here at Reading is very health-driven food production. So of course, now we know this, we want to try to feed both ways into the path. We want to feed back into horticulture and agriculture and try to sort of produce, breed plants or even genetically modify plants which may have higher levels of these compounds. And so you can eat less of them to get a similar effect. But ultimately, it's healthy aging we want to bring about. Now, we're all going to live longer, but I think we all agree we want to be cognitively active and working optimally for as long as possible. And certainly, alongside some of the other things you're going to hear about tonight, we do believe that diet can have some quite significant effects, and particularly those plant-based fruits and vegetables which I've mentioned. So I just wanted to finish off with some take-home messages. So eat a diet rich in fruits and vegetables. I think the current thinking is more than 5 a day. So if you go to some countries, I think Japan is one and America is one, they're almost up to 9 portions a day, which seems very frightening, I know. But as I say, it's not only about fruits and vegetables themselves. It can be juices, it can be things like tea, but try to increase it as much as you can. Brightly coloured, don't be put off by astringent or bitter. We used to eat a lot higher levels of these compounds in the past because our foods used to be more astringent and more bitter, our fruits and vegetables. I remember when I was a child, radishes were a lot more strong in taste because we've bred that out of them now. Don't be misled by commercial terms like superfoods. I'm not saying that they're not good for you, but don't just concentrate on what's termed a superfood. It's a marketing term. They will still give you an effect, but it's not going to be good to concentrate on just those superfoods. Do try to have a mixed and balanced diet. And so aim for variety, don't overconsume, and combine with other things. I've said exercise, but of course brain training is another example of that. So alongside these other things, all together, hopefully they can bring about some quite significant changes. And not only improving in a short-term basis as well, but also there's some evidence to suggest that we can actually stimulate the regrowth of some neurons within the hippocampus from existing stem cell populations within the brain, and that's really exciting. And I think there's going to be a lot more done on that over the next 5 to 10 years. So thank you for your attention, and I think we're doing questions at the end, so I will start.